So we have different routes of exposure and how that's going to impact. There's some major words that we need to know this. So routes of exposure are air, food, soil, water into a baby or a fetus. An example of that is BPA. Solubility is how well things dissolve in water, and oil-soluble things often end up in soil and are stored in fats. So bioaccumulation is increased concentration in an organism over time. So that's in one organism. It's different from biomagnification, which is an increase in chemical concentration in animal tissues as the chemical moves up the food chain. So now we're looking at DDT being in the water, going to plankton, going to the fish, going to the flounder, going to the osprey. So we're looking at biomagnification is what that is. And then persistence is how long the chemical remains in the environment. How quickly or slowly does it break down? What is the half-life of that chemical, that material? Does it break down in a day? Does it break down in 30 years like DDT? If we look at an environmental hazard, it's anything in our environment that can potentially cause harm. And we follow 3 steps to assess this risk of environmental hazards. So we sort of look at what is the risk, we identify the hazard, we characterize the toxicity or the dose that's needed, we determine how exposed we are, and then we decide, is this an acceptable level of risk? And we balance that against the social and the economic and the political considerations. And then there's risk management. So determine a policy with input from private citizens, industry, or different interest groups. A qualitative risk assessment is making a judgment on the relative risks of various decisions based on perception and not probability. So it's not using data, and it may not match the actual risk. It's just something that we know. If we know the speed limit is 45 and the roads are then wet, does it make sense to slow down? Does it make sense to slow down in a snowstorm? There's not necessarily data that proves any of that, but it's sort of what we sort of know. There are official assessments that go on when we're looking at risk management, where we look at actual data, where we look and see what are the odds of these things happening. And so probability in the United States of an individual dying of heart disease is 1 in 5, and cancer is 1 in 7. Motor vehicle accident is 1 in 84. Yet an airplane accident is 1 in 5,051. And yet there's many people who believe airplanes are far more dangerous than motor vehicles. Some of it takes into play our natural born fears or what we're exposed to. If we're going to do a quantitative risk assessment, we're going to look at the probability of being exposed to a hazard times the probability of being harmed if exposed. So we look at the severity of the hazard. Is the hazard not very severe? And it's very unlikely that it's going to happen. We have a low hazard severity. If something is very high, but unlikely we're going to interact with it, then it's medium. If it's very highly severe, we have you're going to die if you come in contact with it, and it's very likely that you are, then that risk is very high. So it ranges on how dangerous the hazard is versus how likely it's going to occur. When we look at risk acceptance, it's the level of risk that can be tolerated. It's a conflict between who is willing to live with some amount of risk and who is not. It's very difficult to analyze that level of risk. Risk management integrates scientific data on risk assessment and the analysis of the acceptable levels of risk with things like economic, social, ethical, and political issues. When we look at chemical regulation that's guided by either, we have 2 different philosophies. One is the innocent until proven guilty principle. And that's based on the philosophy that a potential hazard should not be considered a hazard until the scientific data can definitely demonstrate that a potential hazard causes harm. So we can introduce things quickly, but may potentially cause harm. It allows us to put things on the market quickly and then sort of go backpedal and say, Do we have problems with this? The other principle is the precautionary principle. It's looking at some sort of plausible hazard, and then you have to, the burden is put on the company to prove that their product is safe. It can then take a very long time for products to get on the market. So you have this balance of, well, we're very, very safe, but something that could be potentially beneficial is held up in testing for a long, long time. The United States used the innocent until proven guilty principle. We put things right on the market. A good example is the new vaping devices. They've been put on the market. There's questions about whether or not they are okay. But until it's been proven that they're not, which could take 15, 20 years, they will be on the market. In Europe, they would follow the opposite principle, where they would have to be demonstrated scientifically and proven to be safe before they're allowed to be put on the market, which would delay tremendously the amount of time that would take them to be put on the market. So that's the different rationales that are behind those. And then in terms of monitoring these things, we have the Stockholm Convention. In 2001, 127 countries got together and came up with a list of 12 chemicals to be banned, phased out, or reduced. These include things like DDT, PCBs, and every single one of them on the list was an endocrine disruptor. In 2009, 9 additional chemicals were added and several more were suggested. In Europe, they had a meeting in 2007 called REACH. It's the Registration, Evaluation, Authorization, and Restriction of Chemicals. And they agreed to abide by this precautionary principle to put the burdens on the chemical manufacturers. And how things should be regulated within the European Union. So it's much more conservative than what we have in the United States at this time. And that sort of concludes our unit on risk, which ties together a lot of things that we've learned all year and why different things with the environment are so important. Because it's important that we understand the risks that not addressing many of these environmental concerns bring to us.